So we're still in Chapter 3, Analytic Trigonometry, and we're working on Section 3.2 now, the inverse trigonometric functions continued. So here are our objectives. Find the exact value of expressions involving the inverse, sine, cosine, and tangent functions. So more work on those. And then we need to know the definitions of the inverse, secant, cosecant, and cotangent functions. Then third, we're going to use a calculator to evaluate inverse secant of something, inverse cosecant of something, and inverse cotangent of something with the calculator, but it's going to be a little tricky. And then the last objective is to write a trig expression. So expression, notice there's no equals yet. We're not working on equations yet. Write a trig expression as an algebraic expression. So we're working our way towards solving trig equations. That's really the most important thing we're going to do in this chapter. So we're going to work on these objectives 1 problems together in class so we can talk about them because they're a little bit more complex than the ones we've been working on. But I'll show you how to get started on the first one. You look at the part inside, and then if you look back in your notes from the last section, I suggested that you read this as the angle in quadrant 1 or 2 that has a cosine of a half. So we can draw the angle in cosine 1 or 2 that has a cosine of a half. So it's not this one because that has a cosine of negative a half, right? So it must be quadrant 1. So the angle with a cosine of a half is pi over 3. So this is the same question as what is the sine of pi over 3? And we know it's root 3 over 2. So the second one, you look at the inside first. You say, what's the angle in quadrant 1 or 4 that has a sine of negative a half? Okay, so here's the angle that has a sine of negative a half. So that angle is negative pi over 6. So I want to know what's the tangent of negative pi over 6. And that's going to be the negative root 3 over 3. Okay, and then we'll do more of these in class together so that you can get the idea and practice. Okay, so let's look at the definitions of the inverses of the other 3 trig functions we haven't talked about yet. Inverse secant, inverse cosecant, and inverse cotangent. So we've already talked a little bit about what are going to be the domains and ranges for these. So inverse secant goes with secant, so we have to have the x value be bigger than 1 in absolute value because the secant graph let's see, it's the reciprocal of cosine, so the secant graph goes like this. So see how it's never in here between negative 1 and 1. It has to be outside of 1 in absolute value. And we restrict the domain in the same way as cosine, except remember we have to punch a hole out at pi over 2 because this graph is undefined here. So y is in quadrant 1 or 2 of the unit circle. Remember from 0 to pi is quadrant 1 and 2 of the unit circle. So you need to be able to go back and forth between these two ideas, the horizontal graph and the unit circle. Okay, and then we talk about the inverse cosecant has to have x outside of 1 and negative 1 again because we have this graph that looks like this. And then we need the whole graph. So we need this part right here between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. But remember we have to punch out y equals 0. And then for cotangent, the x value can be any real number, but the y values you get out will be between 0 and pi. So notice that secant inverse and cotangent inverse, those are all similar to cosine inverse with the domain restrictions. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is the cosecant inverse of root 2. And my suggestion is that you think about this by putting an x here. And say, okay, well that means that the cosecant of the cosecant inverse of root 2 equals the cosecant of x. So root 2 equals the cosecant of x. Well, if root 2 equals the cosecant of x, then 1 over root 2 equals, I'm doing the reciprocal of both sides. The reciprocal of cosecant is sine x. So then if I do the sine inverse of both sides, do you see that now x is going to be the sine inverse of 1 over root 2? So this is what I'm going to do on my calculator if it's not a special angle that I just know. So I would suggest you go through this whole long process until you fully understand it. Don't look for shortcuts, look for understanding. Okay, so these ones are the few special angle questions, because let's see, if I multiply by root 2 over root 2, this is sine inverse of root 2 over 2. So I'm saying what angle in quadrant 1 or 4 has a sine of root 2 over 2? Well, that's the angle pi over 4. Okay, so to use a calculator, you have to do the process I just showed you. So we just did a cosecant, so let's do a secant inverse. So if I do the secant of both sides, then I get that -3 is the secant of x. So 1 over -3 is the cosine of x. So cosine inverse of -1/3 is the cosine inverse of the cosine x, which is x. So it's cosine inverse of -1/3, which you're going to do on your calculator. Okay. So Objective 4 we'll work on together in class, and that's it for this lesson.